In the last lesson, we looked at the development of conservatism into what we would describe as the one nation conservative ideology. And in this lesson, we're going to talk specifically about modern conservatism, sometimes referred to as the New Right or New Right conservatism. Now, this is arguably the kind of conservative ideology that spends most of its time in modern political discourse today, and you might be familiar with some of the ideas within the New Right conservatism, and hopefully by the end of this lesson you'll have a better understanding of how modern and the New Right conservative thought actually functions and operates in this in the modern world effectively. So, as I've already mentioned, we sometimes refer to modern conservatism as the New Right, because modern conservatism is quite an umbrella term. It's quite a broad term that can be used, because you could also, fit into this things like Neo-Conservatism, or maybe even to an extent Neoliberalism, as conservative ideologies that would be considered modern conservative ideologies. So it's important to note that it's probably more accurate to refer to this as the New Right view of conservative thinking, because there are other ideas and ideologies that would also be described as a sort of modern theories. And the extent to which they differ is a lot more nuanced, because the neoliberalism and neoconservatism and the New Right, they all share very similar ideas and goals. The new variation, the New Right version of conservatism, was inspired by the work of Ayn Rand and their idea of morality being something of a rational self-interest. Okay, so what this states here is, put very simple, that morality, doing things that are moral and acting in moral ways, is something that is just based on the interests of the individual, their selfish interests of the individual, and that this is a rational idea, this is a rational view. And so it sort of describes human nature as almost selfish in a way. So human nature as being selfish in some kind of way. Now, this is not to be dismissive or to suggest that morality of rational self-interest is something that is pejorative in any particular way. Rand was just simply arguing and came to the conclusion that rational self-interest and the concept of human nature being selfish was just something that was naturally the case. So, from this concept of rational self-interest, Rand starts to develop a number of implications and extensions of what it means to have rational self-interest. So, we start from the base point, the assumption that the idea of morality of rational self-interest, and then we start to think about what this actually means for actual political discourse and policy prescriptions. So this rational self-interest implies that there is a lack of a need for state intervention in the vast majority of everyday life. So in order for the successful implication of this rational self-interest, the influence of the state should be limited as far as possible. And this brings about with it almost libertarian ideas. The reduction of state power so that it can't be imposed on individuals as much as is humanly possible. And the New Right conservative thought doesn't believe, obviously, that the state should have no influence on people's lives at all. Okay, they understand that there are some basic aspects of the state that needs to exist. So, for example, the state should provide armed forces, it should provide a police system, and it should also provide some kind of judiciary. And you could really probably limit everything else, according to a New Right conservative, except for these three things. So these aspects of the state are necessary to maintain the protection of property rights. So what happens here is we have a sort of dichotomy that exists, because the new right wants to see the reduction of the state in as far as possible, but they also want to ensure that property rights are protected insofar as possible. So we have to balance this, because there have to be a limited state intervention in people's lives, but there has to be enough state intervention to provide the kinds of protections for things like the armed forces, or police, and a judiciary. And so you could probably understand that from the limited intervention of the state and that as a kind of policy prescription, there is generally an opposition to public spending on things like welfare in the new right conservative ideas. So things like, public spending on things like welfare, the welfare state, things like in the UK like the NHS and all these other kind of things. These seem to be an encroachment on the freedom and autonomy of individuals. Philosopher Robert Nozick, who we'll talk about in the next lesson, argues that the existence of a welfare state creates a state of dependency, where people depend on the existence of the state. So, people depend on state welfare. Something that Nozick argues was a bad thing. And from these ideas of limited intervention of the state, we can probably come to a conclusion about what the new right thinks about economics, okay, and specifically relating to the free market and capitalism. So the new right believes that the free market is the best way to regulate the appropriate allocation of resources. So don't forget, this is really what economics is all about. We're trying to allocate resources in the most equitable and most appropriate way possible, because we all have an effectively unlimited amount of wants and needs from an economy, but there's only a limited and finite amount of resources. That's why the problem of allocation of resources is something that's important. And the new right believes that the free market, the laws of supply and demand, and the laws of market, free market, free of any kind of regulation, are the best way to do this. So to protect the free market insofar as possible, the new right advocate for all of these different things. So they advocate for cuts in taxation, they advocate for the privatization of all industry. So that means that we take industry that are funded by the government, for example. So like the health industry in the UK is funded by the government through the NHS, and we want to privatize it. We want to put it into the hands of private individuals, into private corporations. And also a deregulation of said industries. So the new right goes in and starts to think about the kinds of rules and regulations and the standardization of regulations that the government impose on certain industries, on things like building regulations, health regulations. And they say that this inhibits the free market. Okay? If you don't need regulations to ensure a good service, good service in certain industries, because the free market will just make sure that if somebody provides a poor service, then the supply of that service, or even the demand for that service will go down, because people aren't going to like it. So therefore, they will go elsewhere, and this encourages an atmosphere of competition within the economy. Cuts in taxation is also interesting because it relates quite fairly to the concept of trickle-down economics. Trickle-down economics. And this is the view that what we should do is that if we cut taxation to the wealthiest of earners, okay, the millionaires and the billionaires, then they will have more money that they can then spend on things in the economy. And then that wealth will eventually just trickle down further and further until it benefits everybody. This is quite a Reaganite and Thatcherite understanding of economics. Finally, I want to talk about social structure. So, really, the new right is divided between the concepts of Neo-Conservatism and Neoliberalism, things that we talked about at the start of this lesson. Neo-Conservatism rejects the concept of the kind of permissiveness and advocates for the ability of people to make their own moral choices. So social conservatism, from this new right perspective, generally advocates for people being allowed and free to do whatever they want. And they believe that the states ought to impose order and public morality. Okay? And this is something that really contradicts within the neo-conservative ideology, because on the one hand, they believe that the state should not interfere in the individual lives of people insofar as they possibly can, but on the other hand, some neo-conservatives within the new right would argue that the state ought to impose order and public morality. Okay? And this has been seen in cases such as the issues around abortion and marriage rights. Neo-conservatism tends to have some kind of connections with quite conservative religious beliefs. So either, Christian, Muslim or Jewish conservative beliefs. And these can also play into the social beliefs that neo-conservatives have. So, for example, things like anti-abortion and anti-same-sex marriage, etc., etc. Neo-conservatives often promote traditional values, again, with religious roots. And neoliberalism, by contrast, arguably neoliberalism doesn't believe that the state should intervene in individual choices. Okay? And so this lack of intervention extends to economics. So neoconservatism and neoliberalism have similar beliefs when it comes to economic intervention. They believe that the economy should be left to the free market and etc., etc. But when it comes to social intervention, neoconservatives tend to lean more towards the imposition of public morality through the state, in cases like, promoting traditional values and religious values, whereas neoliberalism tend to side towards saying that no, the state shouldn't intervene into any individual choices. If you want to do something, then you should be allowed to do it, and that this extends obviously to economics as well. Now, this is not to say that there are no neoliberals who believe that the state should impose traditional values, and that there are no neoconservatives who believe that the state shouldn't be imposing anything. But this is to promote the idea that neoconservatives tend to believe more on social constraints, and neoliberalism is more focused on the kind of hard individualism that exists within the conservative movement. That this kind of individualism and the lack of intervention from the state should also extend to social values as well.